Hey everybody, welcome to Iron Culture, presented by Mass. It is me, Eric Trexler, joined by the Dr. Eric Helms, off of his massive many bodybuilding successes. Helms, how are we doing tonight?
I'm overjoyed to be joined by you so we can talk to the dear listeners who tune into us live. So I'm doing quite well.
Absolutely, that is lovely to hear. I don't want to quote any numbers, don't want to make any of our competitors feel bad about themselves, but people are filing in large numbers to the live chat. Thanks to everyone for joining us. Really appreciate it. I do want to mention, Helms, before we start, if you like the show and you want to support it, there are many ways to do that. Of course, there's the classic. You could like, rate, subscribe, review, all the stuff that makes a podcast or YouTube show grow and thrive and succeed. On top of that, you could support our good friends over at Elite FTS. You could go to elitefts.com if you're in the market, and let's be honest, we're all in the market. Who's not in the market for lifting gear, gym apparel and attire? You name it, they got it. Go over to elitefts.com. Use our code, which is MRR10. That stands for Mass Research Review 10. It'll get you 10% off just about everything in the store over there at Elite FTS. So be sure to support our dear friends and pioneers in the iron game. And then, of course, if you want to be a top tier, gold star, platinum level, elite club member, supporter of the show, be sure to check out the Mass Research Review over at massresearchreview.com. You could become a member. And if you do that, folks, you are going to be more up to date with everything happening in the science of health and fitness and nutrition and strength sport and everything in between. You will be on the cutting edge of the research, and you will enjoy unlimited power almost. I don't want to say unlimited, but nearly unlimited power. A tremendous ability to conquer your foes who may try to stand between you and your lifting goals. If you happen to compete in anything, you will win. It will make you stronger, bigger, leaner, and generally more happy and functionally just across all realms of life, an elite person. Not an elitist, but an elite person. So be sure to check out the Mass Research Review. All right, Helms. Speaking of research, couple big things going on this week in research, Helms.
Oh, yeah.
So I've had things hitting my inbox. In some cases, people purporting.
Can I ask if things are
Yes.
okay over there at Duke now that the entire theory, philosophy, and identity of your research colleagues have been destroyed by this recent paper?
So it's actually interesting. I can't tell you for sure if things are okay because no one's come to work since. I think we all just saw
sense.
the jig is up. Most people have left town. We're just gone. I went into the lab. There was no equipment there. There were no chairs. There are still desks because those are heavy. Those are hard to move. But basically, there's a paper that came out recently, and a bunch of people sent it to me basically wondering if the constrained energy expenditure model is essentially debunked, done with, goner. So I definitely want to address that in this episode. There's also new research that hit my desk about non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs and how they might impact lifting. And Helms, the last thing we're going to hit today, I know that there was a major dust-up in the fitness world, all sorts of conversation about what is a PhD, who gets one, who should have one, who decides who should have one. So we had an Iron Culture episode all about the mechanics of acquiring a PhD, and you were noticeably sad. You didn't get to join in on the fun, which is, some would say, what happens when you stop showing up. So that you may have
Allegedly.
some culpability in the matter. But you understandably wanted to throw your 2 cents in because, among many other reasons, you fled the United States and did your PhD elsewhere. And one of the interesting things about PhD programs is that there is a high degree of what I might call regionality, in the sense that not every country does it the same way. There are different models, each one with its own kind of set of pros and cons. And so you wanted to provide even more context on what some international PhD programs might look like, which I presume, and this is not something I have experience with, but I presume it will give us an even more well-rounded understanding of those main questions. What is a PhD? Who gets one? Who decides who gets one? What does it really mean if you have one? And if you do have one, should I listen to you? Period. Stop.
Absolutely.
End of sentence. So first things first, Helms, we need to talk a little bit of research. So why don't we go ahead and dive in? I'm going to use the visual visual elements in this episode.
What a lucky audience we have on this live one.
Yeah, if you are on YouTube, boy, are you lucky, because you're looking at not just a couple handsome faces, you're not just hearing the beautiful tones, but you are seeing a paper on your screen right now from PNAS. This is a very high-level journal, and you are seeing a paper with the title, which is Physical Activity is Directly Associated with Total Energy Expenditure Without Evidence of Constraint or Compensation. Now, if you do not follow the work of the lab I work in Duke University, run by Herman Poncer, you may hear those words arranged in that order and say, means nothing to me, don't care, not sure what we're talking about. But if you are someone who's kind of tapped into, the leading edge of research as it pertains to exercise and metabolism, metabolic regulation, then you hear those words in a sentence and you think, this looks a bit controversial. So basically, I think it's probably useful to start with a quick rundown of what are these two main terms we're seeing. So energy constraint and energy compensation. Now, these two terms are fundamentally related in my realm, the kind of work that I do. So as I alluded to, the research I do here at Duke University, the vast majority of it is out of Herman Poncer's lab, where I'm a research scholar of high esteem, I would add. But Herman pioneered what is called the constrained total energy expenditure model. And I'm going to show that on the screen really quickly, a little image that gives like a very, very simplistic view of what it's getting at. So you see on the left side of the image here, physical activity on the x-axis and total energy expenditure on the y-axis. Notably, none of these axes are labeled. This is kind of just a conceptual diagram to give you vibes and directionality. So on the left hand here, we have what we call the additive model. And the additive model is kind of like everyone's basic gut feeling assumption, right? Which is that if I do more physical activity, then my total calories burned for the day, my total energy expenditure will go up. And it will go up in a linear fashion, which is linearly related to how much more exercise or physical activity I'm doing. And so the kind of natural conclusion that you draw from this relationship would be, if I decided I'm going to start doing 200 calories of extra cardio or physical activity every single day, 7 days a week, you would expect that your total daily energy expenditure would go up by 200 calories. 200 more calories of cardio, 200 more calories of total energy expenditure. Well, Herman Poncer, who I work with, have a great deal of respect for. He's really awesome to work with, a very, very good scientist. He posited an alternative model, which is called the constrained model. And the original kind of impetus for this is that Herman's lab, even though I'm in it, it is not an exercise science lab per se. This lab is housed in the Department of Evolutionary Anthropology. And in evolutionary anthropology, you often do a lot of field work. And so every summer we'll have usually graduate students who will go out and work in Tanzania, or they'll work in northern Kenya. Those are the two main sites we've been doing in recent years. So working with the Hadza hunter-gatherer community, or working with the Dawsonage community in northern Kenya. And these are what we call... Yeah, go ahead.
Trex, are you going to get an opportunity to go to either one of these locations in your research in the future?
I think the opportunity's always there. But Helms, I am a very unadventurous traveler. So that kind of experience, I wouldn't knock it. I'm not saying that it is not cool. I'm saying that I am just boring and not someone who would enjoy the field work. It's rough living. For sure. And I like my cushy little life that I've set up here in North Carolina. So yeah, it's the people in our lab that do the field work love it. They have a great time. I think they're just a little bit more adventurous than I am, and that works for me. But yeah, maybe someday I'll become less boring, more interesting, more adventurous, and I'll finally make a trip out there. But but anyway, so in some of Herman's early work, working with what we call the term that's often used is subsistence populations, meaning populations who have subsistence economies. They have little to no market integration. The calories that they eat come directly from them doing really hard labor, kind of manual farming where they grow what they eat and no more. So they're not growing, massive stocks of corn and grain and then selling 2/3 of it. What they grow, they eat, period. Or they may do some small scale herding of livestock, or they may do, more traditional hunting and gathering. And so those are kind of the main ways that these communities acquire the calories that feed their community. And so in doing research in those populations, Herman was doing all these metabolic assessments and doing doubly labeled water, kind of gold standard for total energy expenditure. And, the kind of low level, kind of simple takeaway was people's energy expenditures were much lower than he anticipated. We're talking about people who, in many cases, depending on which community and what role that person has in the community, whereas an American might be taking, 4, 5, 6,000 steps a day, they may be taking 25, 30, 35,000 steps a day. And again, it's not just hunting and gathering, it's also getting water, which is usually from, right now, the Dawsonage community that we work with in northern Kenya. It's a hike to go get potable water on a daily basis. So anyway, with those activity levels, you'd think, man, they must be burning 4,000, 4,500 calories per day with just the pure mileage that's going into the walking and jogging. And at the end of the day, after controlling for body size and body composition, their energy expenditures were not all that dissimilar from very sedentary Americans who have 100% market integration and hardly move throughout the day in many cases. And so this kind of led to this whole line of research of figuring out, is it really so simple that more physical activity or more cardio goes directly to a linear increase in total energy expenditure? And from looking at a variety of populations, for example, hunter-gatherers who are highly active on what I would call limited caloric, they're under limited calorie constraints, I would say, in terms of just the caloric availability, in that community. So, it's not like, if I wanted to just, eat 6,000 calories a day, that would not be a very hard thing for me to do, right? Go to the grocery store, get a bunch of junk food, easy. But in these communities with more limited caloric resources, it's this double whammy of very, fewer calories available and very high activity levels. So that was one area where this constraint was seen. Another area was in ultra endurance athletes. Another area was in people who are doing cardio interventions for weight loss and not losing as much weight as we would predict. And we're talking about not even close. Helms, you've written about this in Mass multiple times, but we've seen studies where people lose 20, 30, 40% of what they were supposed to lose. So less than half in most cases. And so the idea here is, and if you follow me, then you've heard me talk about metabolic adaptation before. I've always been interested in how the human body can creatively kind of downregulate certain elements of energy expenditure to make up for energetic constraints. So I used to, mostly study metabolic adaptation, which is dietary restriction leading to compensatory adaptive reductions in other components of energy expenditure, primarily non-exercise activity thermogenesis. And when an acute deficit is present, also resting metabolic rate. So we see these down regulations in certain elements of energy expenditure. And what Herman has been studying since, it's been over a decade now, has been looking at energy constraint from high levels of physical activity. And the idea is that as you go from low activity to moderate activity, there is a pretty linear relationship. Nothing really interesting is happening. But the model posits that as you go from moderate activity to high or extremely high activity, the higher you go, we start to see that in order to keep total energy expenditure within a workable range so that you're just not immediately in a massive energy deficit, we're seeing similar, I'm not yet comfortable saying identical, but we're seeing similar downregulation of some elements of our energy expenditure that we can sacrifice, right? So, for example, if you're looking at someone who is in a constrained energy state, whether it's from dietary restriction or moderate calories and extremely high levels of activity, Helms, I mean, you can predict when we draw their blood, what's it going to look like, right? It's going to be low thyroid hormone, probably low sex hormones. They may have low libido. We may find some indicators of less immune response, right? So these, yeah.
Yeah, like you're bringing up. This is going to sound very familiar, like many things on human survival anthropology, to people who choose to compete, quote unquote, in in bodybuilding, where we choose this, and I know you and I have both talked about how we'd love to see how does the more quantitative, hardcore assessment of larger groups of physique athletes play out in the context of the constrained energy model, as well as metabolic adaptation, and how they probably share similar roots. And I think, like you said, similar, not identical. And that's largely just because I think that we need more research to back that up. But Trex, I think you've done a great job, and Iron Culture is well familiar with the lead-in, the concept of the constrained
Yes.
energy model, as well as metabolic adaptation.
Yes.
And I will also say that there is some research that does indicate that the constrained energy expenditure model, although it's not in every single study, but there is some notable research, rears its ugly head, or annoying head, if you're trying to actually expend energy. I'm sure people trying to live on subsistence lifestyles have no problem with this because they, actually it's useful for survival. But if you're trying to lose fat, or if you're trying to have performance and health in the face of constrained energy and large energy expenditure, could be framed as a negative. But there is at least one study indicating that the constrained energy model rears its ugly head a little more in an energy deficit versus when you're in an energy surplus. So with that lineup, like I think we do. People know what where you're at, what you've been studying. The cult's been here for a while. What is this new paper, which by the way has John Speakman on it? So we have a clash of the Titans, Speakman versus Poncer, 2025. What does this paper claim, and how does it supposedly debunk this model?
Yeah, and I'll speed up here because I get what's going on here. You're giving me the tap in the watch, move along. We know this stuff, but I'll jump in. Okay, so yes, this paper, like you said, John Speakman's on it, which is a big deal. I know Herman and John have published before and are, have regular communication. John Speakman is a legend in the doubly labeled water game. So this is not some, little tiny paper in some obscure journal with some no-name authors. These are heavy hitters. Kevin Davey, John Speakman. PNAS is one of the most prestigious journals you're going to find out there. And so I'm going to write a full write-up on this in the Mass Research Review that's going to go into a lot more detail. Helms is sitting there tapping his watch, telling me I got to hurry up. So, but here's what I want to say.
I just think you gave a really comprehensive introduction, and I could see that the introduction was going further. Honestly, if we did this for 2 hours or 1 hour, I was like, they're well set up, my friend.
Yes,
let's jump in.
Absolutely. So here's what I want to do. I'm going to give you just the very short highlights. Like I said, in the Mass Research Review, in about a month, I'm going to give a much more in-depth breakdown and kind of present a more integrated model of how I see this topic. But the short version is it's a bit of a misnomer. Well, here's what I will say, being charitable to critics of the model. The model is one of those things where I think you have to be very, very intentional about how you frame it. And I do think there have been instances where it's been described in a way where you could look at the data in this new study and say it doesn't hold up, right? So if all we're going to do is say that the constrained model suggests that as physical activity goes up, total energy expenditure should fit this kind of curvy pattern rather than a linear pattern. If you want to simplify it to that level, I think then you could say, well, yeah, they looked, they did a linear fit, curvilinear fit. It looked like more physical activity equals more energy expenditure in a fairly linear fashion. Therefore, constrained hypothesis is dead, additive model lives. Much ado about nothing. Now we can move on with our lives. And so what I'm showing you on the screen right here is, if we look at these red dots, this is total energy expenditure against physical activity measured via accelerometry. And you can see it's far from a beautiful, tight straight line, but it does look fairly linear in nature. But to me, and Helms, the receipts exist. I've talked about this before. I've written about it many, many times. The receipts exist. I have always, in my opinion, been pretty consistent. I hope I've been consistent about my understanding of this model, which is I always bring it back to metabolic adaptation. Because that's why I got into it, right? I've been talking about metabolic adaptation since 2013, and I saw this research and said, I think that's the other side of the same coin, right? And that's what motivated me to dive in and join Herman's lab and say, let's try to break this model. Let's pull it apart, put it back together. Let's see what we can do here.
And as an aside, I thought it was really cool that at the same time as you were looking at metabolic adaptation and the constrained energy model as two sides of the same coin, I was having parallel thoughts with REDS and metabolic adaptation.
Right.
So it's actually been really cool to see the two of us, and also the set point theory.
Yeah.
Speaking of Speakman.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, go ahead.
There's clearly this convergence of ideas, but at the end of the day, the core kind of theme underlying all of it, that the main thing at the center, the impetus for all of it, the driver of all of it is, in order for these weird adaptive things to be happening, which are counterintuitive to some extent, and we're trying to measure them and they're hard to measure, but in order for these adaptive things to happen, there must be something to actually adapt to, some kind of stimulus, or I would say stressor. There has to be a problem for this to be a solution. Mm-hmm. And so that's why when I talk about the constrained energy expenditure model, I don't necessarily always frame it when I'm talking about it as, well, the more physical activity you do, the more constraint you get. What I usually talk about, because I'm so interested in metabolic adaptation, is what is actually causing an energy deficit or a state of low energy availability. To me, that seems to be the driver, which is why we see some of the best evidence of the constraint model is actually in weight loss studies that are using cardio as a tool, which makes you wonder, am I looking at metabolic adaptation or am I looking at, exercise energy compensation? And frankly, doesn't matter. Are they just kind of the same thing? And so the main thing I want to highlight in this paper is when we talk about where we should see constraint happening, I don't typically talk about it as this kind of linear or, the straight line where more physical activity beyond this point means more constraint, or, it's going to have to fit this perfect curved line. What I talk about is, are you doing something to actually cause a need for constraint? Are you doing something to constrain your energy availability such that we should be having any kind of adaptive reductions occurring? So the one obvious case is when someone is, like I said, dieting and being physically active, immediately we have, we can induce low energy availability by just not eating enough, period. And there's a lot of evidence for constraint occurring in those scenarios. One of the biggest things that our lab has proposed is not that there's no relationship between physical activity and expenditure, right? Athletes burn more calories than non-athletes. It simply is what it is. More activity for them leads to higher expenditure. But a common theme in our lab has been, for long-term sustained energy expenditure, we rarely see metabolic scopes go above 2.5. And metabolic scope is an easy calculation: total energy expenditure divided by basal metabolic rate. And so what's really, really cool about this whole exchange, and we don't get bent out of shape when people say, hey, look, your stupid model broke. Because first of all, it's not mine, it's Herman, so it's his problem. But what's really cool about this is, so we just published a paper, our lab, I wasn't on it, Herman was, but this was with Andrew Best, great collaborator, but it was in ultra endurance athletes. This was literally published like within days of this other paper that is very critical of it was one day before this other paper. So the paper out of our lab was in ultra endurance athletes. So people who do competitive endurance events that are longer than marathons, people who train really, really, really crazy amounts. And the short version of what we found in that paper was, hey, it looks like the constrained model is doing pretty good here because people are not seeming to maintain a metabolic scope of over 2.5, even though they're doing these really crazy extreme endurance training programs to prepare for ultra marathons. So people for a short term can go above 2.5, but they tend for like long-term day-to-day maintenance level of expenditure, it seems to always kind of drift downward and get capped at about 2.5. And so what's really cool about this paper that claims to have kind of, taken a chunk out of the constrained expenditure model is I'm scrolling to the figure here, and this is the last thing I'll say, Helms. If we look at the bottom right figure here, which is physical activity versus metabolic scope, you can literally look at these four highest lines, or the four highest data points, which stand way tall above the rest of them, draw a straight line across them exactly at 2.5, which is honestly kind of insane. So what's really funny about this paper is it got published, and a lot of people were like, I bet you guys are pissed or, worried or, doubting everything you've ever said. And we're like, no, oh my God, like look at this straight line at 2.5, which seems to be indicating like, and what's crazy about it is that this paper reports that there is some number of ultra endurance athletes in it. Wow. Which means that like we're looking at people who should have some of the highest expenditures relative to basal metabolic rate that we would really ever anticipate observing. And this cap of 2.5, this is now like several papers in a row that have said we're going to find like people who do insane amounts of exercise, and we're just not finding people getting above that. And what's really weird is how consistent that 2.5 cap seems to be. And so what's really funny about it, like I was getting at, is a lot of people are like, are you guys kind of annoyed or confused or feeling some kind of way about this paper? And we're like, no, we think this is tremendous evidence for what we've been saying in our last several papers, including the one that came out the day before. Literally, it was published in Current Biology, and those papers have like little bullet points at the top, summaries, and literally one of the 4 bullet points was cohort mean 52-week expenditure did not exceed 2.5 times basal metabolic rate. Like that's a number we've had circled since 2019-ish, and it comes up again and again and again. So I can't speak for anyone but me. I haven't talked to Herman about this paper yet. My belief is that the constrained model works when the constrained model should work, which is, if I were to add, and I've actually done this when people send me the paper, Helms, I say, before we talk about the paper, how many calories does an ultra endurance athlete burn every day? And they give me a number that's 2,000 calories higher than what's being observed in these studies. Invariably. Everyone says, 6, 8, 10,000 calories a day. I'm like, try 3,600.
35.
Yeah. And so some people are going to hear this, and if they already have their mind up, they're going to say, oh, you guys are just kind of, reworking the hypothesis after results are observed. But it's been since 2019 that we've been saying that.
And I will say, reworking a hypothesis after new observations occur is exactly what should be happening. Because unlike the internet, where what you do when someone disagrees with your quote-unquote model is you block them, ban them, and then just shift the goalposts and act like that's always been the case, actual models and hypotheses, which graduate to theories, this is exactly what we're supposed to be doing. And we've talked about this on Iron Culture, is we chip away at them, not because we were trying to throw the baby out with the bathwater or poison the well. We're trying to constrain the model to the points where it does hold up and identify where it does not, so it can actually become a theory that is more and more correct over time. And shout out to the statistician George Box, all models are wrong, some models are useful. This is effectively reducing the instances where it is wrong and increasing the instances where it is useful. Energy deficit. A time component. You might be able to run a marathon today and burn 6,000 calories, but if you do it every day, what happens to other components? Where do those components come from that are reducing to prevent us from going over 2.5, and how robust is 2.5, and in what conditions can it be exceeded, reached, etc.? And then, the same thing is true. Like of REDS right now, REDS does not acknowledge body fat at all in its model. There's a couple of scant things if you look at the 2023 update where they mention like, hey, sometimes maybe leaner people, we see this more often. But I think a big hole in the Reds framework is that it basically, if you were to say, oh, well, if I, so long as I provide someone enough kcals per kilogram of lean mass, regardless of if they've dieted down to 4% body fat, and if they eat sufficiently, that they'll be fine. Now, the catch is that if you eat quote unquote sufficiently, if your energy availability is high enough, in most people, unless they have a really, really low set point, they will no longer retain that set point.
Yeah.
But all of these things are in process, and these models are going to become more and more and more refined, and that's what should be happening. So this is a good thing no matter how you slice it.
Yeah, yeah, and that's the thing that I took the job in Herman's lab in 2023. Didn't know him, obviously, just knew his work. And you never know. Some researchers have these huge egos. They live and die by their theories. The thing that jumped out to me was he's always been open about we are trying to break the model, not build the model. And so we try to run the studies where we actually thought we could break that ceiling. 2.5, just to speak to how we've had that number circled, we had sometimes pregnancy alone will bring you up to 2.2-ish, right? Because you're growing a whole fetus, right? Especially during those high growth periods. And so we did a study, a great PhD student did their dissertation recently, where we were looking at the total energy expenditure daily of pregnant marathon runners. So people who are still keeping up with pretty high volume running while growing a fetus in like peak, fetal growth periods. And we thought if anyone's going to break 2.5, it's them. And I haven't seen the final data in paper form. It's not published yet, but I can speak to the conference presentation because it's out there. It's been presented. And the initial returns, we did not see people breaking that, which is really insane because usually you flirt with that limit just from being pregnant or just from being a marathon runner. So being a pregnant marathon runner did not have an additive effect that broke over that cap, which leads us to believe it caused adaptations that dug even deeper, right? To make sure that total expenditure was constrained in a workable level. So all that is to say, folks, I am going to write in more detail about this. I know that's a very superficial look at it, but the take-home point is there should be a reason for energetic adaptations if you're going to expect energetic adaptations. If a rugby player is doing a little bit of extra physical activity and they're fueling that activity with a bunch of extra calories, of course their energy expenditure is going to go up. Why not? Why not linearly, right? But when we talk about either constraints on intake plus high levels of cardio or such extreme high levels of cardio that you cannot replace the energy because it's just too much. Those are the areas where this constrained energy expenditure model really shines. And I do think that we probably, if I could, throw a bone to the critics, we probably have to, I will probably get away from using that classic figure, even though it's a simple explanation. It may be oversimplistic in the sense that it doesn't account for how much energy is coming in. And so if somebody wanted to critique that particular figure, I'd say, you're right. That's probably, it conveys the point in a simple way, but probably too simple. And so I'll definitely grant them that. But this is all a big teaser because I will have an article about this. And Helms, you may remember, I wrote a mass article called I Was So Right and So Wrong About Metabolic Adaptation and Exercise Energy Compensation. Because basically, this was over a year ago. I initially was like, I think these things are super tightly related. And then a paper came out that led me to believe they're probably two sides of the same coin, but fundamentally different sides. I think I'm leaning back toward them being much more similar than distinct.
They've got to be, man.
I think they're way more similar. So I think my next article is going to be, I was so wrong about being wrong about metabolic adaptation and exercise energy compensation. And again, listen, that's reality. I didn't get into this stuff because I knew the answers. I got into it because I wanted to know the answers. And like you were saying, I'm willing to change my mind 10 times and 20 times, however many times it takes.
How many times, baby?
We're going to keep doing the
Science
studies.
Is questions.
We're going to keep trying to figure this out.
Science is about questions, not answers. I know many people think they're science-based, but when in reality, they just really, really like definitive, quantitative, black and white rules, and you got to be careful. You got to be careful. A commitment to science is not just a new set of rules for a new 10 Commandments or a new guru or to feel confident with your banking and your worldview. You need to destroy your worldview regularly and look for ways you were wrong, not ways you were right. And Trex, you embody that, and I respect it.
Hey, if I am going to be the official wrong guy of fitness, what a crown to take, right?
That's right.
So Helms, I know I sprung this on you last minute, so I don't expect that we're going to go into a lot of detail on this other study, but the people have been reaching out. I think they'd want at least a superficial kind of get up to speed about what the literature says on this topic. So a new paper came across my desk. NSAID ingestion augments training-induced muscle hypertrophy and differentially affects muscle mRNA expression, but not strength gains in trained men. First of all, minus points for a long title, but plus points for being a cool study. This is by Mallinson and colleagues, published very recent, just yesterday in
Yeah.
2025. Now, Helms, I'm going to give the brief little intro, and then I'm going to hand it over to you for your thoughts, and you can give us some more historical context on this.
Yep.
But this study, what was the name of this NSAID that they used again? Do you happen to
It
remember?
is specific. Well, the brand name is often Voltaren. That's probably the most common one, but it's
Okay.
diflon. Hold on, let me make sure I pronounce it right. It is diclofenac.
Okay. So this is one. Was this big in America? Did you know about this when you were in America or after moving to New Zealand?
No, first time I saw Voltaren, it was really common when I was weightlifting in New Zealand because it's often in a cream form.
Okay.
So you can apply it topically to different areas. And in the
Interesting.
U.S., it's most commonly used, if I recall correctly, by people with osteoarthritis or rheumatoid arthritis, and it's in like a 1% topical cream, and they use it locally. But it is a NSAID that, well, I'll get into how it differs from ibuprofen
Yeah,
and other
so
drugs. Yeah.
in this particular study, I should mention they took it orally, and so it looks like they took it in capsule form.
Yep.
But this was a study which I'm sure you'll highlight. It was a 12-week study, which is a bit long compared to others in this area, comparing NSAID versus placebo, seeing out how it would impact strength and hypertrophy. What they found was, quoting here, NSAID intervention produced greater muscle hypertrophy than placebo, which occurred between 28 and 84 days of resistance training and was paralleled by more pronounced muscle mRNA changes. Their collective events were not accompanied by greater strength gains. So what's really interesting about this is 12-week study used NSAIDs, and I buried the lead here. These were 24-year-old trained males with a BMI
Hmm.
on average of 24. So Helms, naturally, I think you were probably surprised to see the headline, at least at first. So why don't you give us a little background and kind of let us know your initial gut feelings about this without us having time to, get deep into it.
Yeah, because we're definitely gonna have to look into this at mass, talk about it a bit more. I'm gonna have to dive into some of the mechanisms of COX-1 and 2 inhibition,
Yeah.
and prostaglandin production, and the role in hypertrophy. Break out the old Gemini and ask it if I'm missing anything. And after uploading, multiple papers on metabolic pathways and things like that. So there's an interesting history here. I've written about it in mass. There's papers that have been published in '06, 2013, 2018 by different authors comparing different NSAIDs. So that's non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, which is a mechanism of anti-inflammation and analgesic pain, management drugs in different populations at different doses with different types of protocols. And probably the two most well-known ones historically, I want to say, is a paper by Trapp and colleagues, and that came out back in
It's
I
like
want to
11.
say 2010 or 2011.
Yeah.
Yeah, and what they observed is they compared acetaminophen and ibuprofen. Acetaminophen is that Advil or aspirin? I think it's aspirin. Um,
Tylenol, acetaminophen.
yes. Yeah.
I'm
It's
sure
it's
that,
actually
that
a
that's
very
my go-to. You're not gonna get that one
See,
past
yeah,
me.
now I gotta make sure. Yeah, acetaminophen over the counter is Tylenol. Yeah, thank you. So yeah, it's not an NSAID, which is important about acetaminophen.
Yeah.
So it was compared at a low dose to maximal dose ibuprofen, which is a potent non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug in this study, and roughly twice the percentage gains in hypertrophy were observed in those young, untrained resistance training individuals over, I think, 8 weeks. So the idea here was that something about the mechanism of ibuprofen was inhibiting a potential hypertrophy. And the hypotheses in that paper and prior papers were interesting because exercise does cause pain. And as we have talked about, like RPE values get less accurate or proximity to failure as you get closer and closer to failure with really, really high rep sets because of discomfort. And when you look at affect, people rate high rep training and low rep training, more pleasurable or like a positive or negative affect. So pain inhibition is one of the potential mechanisms which caffeine actually is thought to be ergogenic.
Yeah.
Like if you look at cycling bouts to exhaustion, it could be related to calcium handling. It could be related to central nervous system stimulation, combination of the two, or even have direct effects on muscle. But one of the
Back in the
mechanisms
day,
which does
everybody
go
was
ahead.
obsessed with catecholamines and glycogen spare,
Yes.
all metabolic types of explanations. But yeah,
But yeah, caffeine is a mild analgesic, and other analgesics have been proposed as potential performance enhancing drugs because they enable you to potentially push closer to a discomforting area where performance is higher. So the hypotheses in these 20 mid 2000 studies and in this paper by Trapp were, hey, we're not sure if it's going to be beneficial, but messing with inflammation, look at all these overlapping mechanisms with muscle damage and hypertrophy and pathways. It could be interfering with prostaglandin production and potentially impacting even mTOR. And lo and behold, they found that the gains were greater in the acetaminophen group than the ibuprofen group. Then, interestingly enough, almost the exact same protocol is done by Lilja, I want to say 2017 or 2018, but this time in elderly men, and the NSAID group actually gets more hypertrophy than the group not taking NSAIDs. So the kind of collective view on this is that maybe it is related to having the optimal range of inflammation, which is something that is, reared its head in obesity research, metabolic disease, management of pain, osteoarthritis, all kinds of areas. Is that
stuff with
inflammation is a
the elderly.
process? Absolutely.
Yeah.
It is a inflammation is a useful process and necessary process in our body, not a good or bad thing, despite what influencers will state. And in general, inflammation scales with age and also other issues. So older individuals might actually benefit from NSAIDs, while younger individuals, perhaps it's suppressing it too low. And that's where we sat. But now this study adds another layer of complexity because it was younger individuals. Now, the interesting thing here is that diclofenac is a COX-1 inhibitor primarily, while ibuprofen, I believe, is a COX-2 inhibitor. It may be COX-1 and 2. I'm not going to pretend to be really familiar with these pathways. I haven't looked at it in a bit. And those have different potential downstream effects. And this study, TRAP, and maybe one other have actually looked at some of the anabolic signaling and actually looking at myogenic responses, and they do see differences. So ultimately, there's a few interacting effects here because this is also a 12-week study, not an 8-week study, and they use concentric training primarily, and a higher volume than we've seen in other studies, and a different population in terms of training status. So all of this is to say that there's going to be a collection of factors which lead to whether or not your training is producing and whether or not your environment and your characteristics as an individual is resulting in an optimal or suboptimal inflammatory status, and for how long. And then what would a potentially divergent method of dealing with inflammation through different mechanisms of COX inhibition have as an impact on that? And it appears that the answer is by no means straightforward, that your age and the drug itself under the class of NSAIDs can have an impact. And another thing I would point out is that it's also possible that in previous research where ibuprofen was said to have attenuated hypertrophy, maybe we're actually seeing a improvement from just pure pain inhibition that's also contaminating those waters a little bit. We need more control groups in this research, and these are small samples. So there's a potential performance-enhancing effect of the analgesic effect, and there's a variable effect of actually inhibiting the COX enzymes and affecting inflammation depending upon how it's done and who it's done in and the way they're training, which is going to end up in some result. So, Yeah, I think it's actually quite fascinating, and
Yeah.
I think now the jury is kind of out, but I am comfortable saying it probably has to do with baseline inflammation and the method by which inflammation is managed and the type of training that is being used.
Yeah, it's a shame because it used to be so simple. We had a small group of studies that said if you're older and you have high baseline inflammation, this stuff improves hypertrophy. If you're young and you don't, it'll either hinder or have no effect. And now it gets more complicated. One of the things that I'm sure we'll look into as a mass crew, because I'm sure we'll be covering this in the near future, is with that analgesic part of it. It's very interesting that hypertrophy was improved, but not strength, especially over like a solid, 12 weeks is not super long, but it's nothing to sneeze at. So I'll be curious to see how we kind of dig into like how much of this differentiating from prior research is it going to come down to those particulars of COX-1 versus COX-2. And a lot of them will inhibit both to some extent, but they'll be a little more preferential for 1 versus 2 or 2 versus 1, or they'll be fully non-selective and do it all. So it may come down to those particulars, may come down to baseline inflammation, may come down to trained versus, at this point, all things are on the table. But here's what I would say, Helms. Until we can write that in-depth thing, because like I said, this paper just came out literally yesterday, so we haven't had time to really dive in. Until then, here's what I will say, Helms. I would urge people not to use NSAIDs as a daily performance-enhancing intervention, because what you'll find with most NSAIDs is that, listen, I'm never shy about if I have a bad headache, I'll take an ibuprofen, Tylenol, whatever. I'm not worried. I know Tylenol's not an NSAID, but hear me out. These over-the-counter analgesic remedies, almost all of them will have some kind of little warning that says, hey, this really isn't for everyday use. And if you do use it every day, there's a likelihood or a possibility you may develop some side effects that you don't like. So I was talking to someone earlier, and they're like, does this mean NSAIDs are like a hypertrophy supplement? I'm like, let's not even go there, in the sense of we need to really get to the bottom of this and then do a sober risk assessment, cost benefit, because these things do have side effects if consumed over long periods of time. Sometimes it's worth it, right? Sometimes if you're like, hey, my doctor told me max out the daily ibuprofen dose for the next 4 to 6 weeks because I got stuff going on. Like we gotta figure it out, right? But that's very different from a completely healthy person who just says, I guess for the rest of my life, I'm taking NSAIDs at a maximal dose every day. Totally different.
Yeah. Yeah, this stuff has unique clinical applications specific to the drug. Like, for example, when I got my bilateral hip surgery and they had actually prepared my labrums and shaved down the bone specifically on my cam lesion, which just means that my femur had growth from impact that was causing issues. I was on max dose ibuprofen for several weeks because it actually inhibits bone reformation, which sometimes is occurs when you shave bone. It's like, oh, you're damaging me. I need to regrow this bone, and that also is impacted by COX inhibition. But there's also, like, we need to think about not even only drug versus drug comparisons, but the dose response, because they used a maximal dose of ibuprofen in this study by TRAP, and I believe by Lilja. Diclofenac in this one, they used at 75 milligrams, which I think is half the max dose of 150 milligrams.
Okay.
So this is another consideration. It's possible if they'd used 150 milligrams, we would have seen the same thing. So, and there are some studies which are also null. I think there was one in '06 where there was really no difference between ibuprofen and a control group. So there's a lot to be done here.
Yeah.
And I think it's because we are manipulating a variable which has an optimal range with something that could be insufficient or too much on either side. And also, it's these are bigger studies than we get in typical exercise science. But they're not huge. These are definitely not like well-funded medical studies. 6 sites. Let's do the damn thing and throw NIH funding at it or anything like that.
Yeah. Yeah, it is crazy. Like I have, now that my research has deviated out of exercise science, now I actually have been involved with some, like multi-million-dollar studies, and it is a fundamentally different ballgame. Like it's, yeah. So maybe someday we'll have some of that stuff going on in exercise science, but no. So I think at the end of the day, these are 2 research topics we've covered very briefly here that I think at the end of the day, they kind of show that a lot of times with research, it's going to come down to very nuanced interpretations. It's not always this perfect. Is it a curve or is it linear? It's like, well, it depends. Are you cutting calories?
Yeah.
Are you doing so much that you're not able to refuel? In this case, well, what's your baseline inflammation? Which COX inhibitor are you taking? What dose are you taking? So research is about getting clarity, but that doesn't always mean getting simple clarity. Sometimes things actually end up being kind of complicated. So we will dive into that and more. But Helms, very briefly, I know you wanted to give at least a little brief commentary on some of the international elements of PhDs, kind of filling in the gaps. If people haven't gotten up to speed with the basics, I did a whole episode on this. I forget which episode number, but it was, what does your favorite FitPros PhD really mean or actually mean? So it was a few episodes ago. But Helms, enlighten us a little bit on the international view of this, because my red-blooded American self neglected that small portion of the world that is not the United States.
Yeah. No, it's actually kind of interesting because I had to kind of a very, I wouldn't say rude awakening, but I had to understand a completely different model of PhDs once I started looking overseas and how it is typically or more typically done in English-speaking countries overseas. 'Cause that's kind of what I was constrained to. So the UK, Australia, New Zealand, and other parts of Western Europe follow this model. And places where you can do an English PhD in Europe. So, for example, Germany is pretty similar to this. And even it also differs between Canada and the U.S., where it's sometimes more like Europe or more like the U.S. And it's actually quite interesting that U.S. is a bit of the outlier. So the biggest
Would you
distinction
say it's
is that
exceptional?
it does have exceptions
Yeah.
to the way other places are done.
There you go.
I'd say that the biggest differentiation, and there's a bunch of small ones, is that outside of the U.S., a PhD is most of the time a pure research degree. And you know how you described ABD, all but dissertation? Like, I've done everything. I took my 2 years of classes, I've taken my comprehensive exams, and now I just need to do my dissertation. And it feels like you're at the end of the line,
Yeah.
when in reality, the dissertation is actually probably the hardest part. Overseas, you start at the point where all you have left is to do your dissertation. To even get into the program,
Yeah.
you have to do other things that are much more common overseas. And this is because the entire education system is structured different in the university level in the US, Australia, and New Zealand. So, for example, and you could spin this to make the US sound amazing, bachelor's degrees are typically 3 years long in the UK, Australia, and New Zealand, not 4. But the entire 3 years are dedicated to your topic. So you get 3 years of specific study. And I always laugh when I hear our undergraduate students in the US talk about what major they have in the first 2 years, because they're basically just redoing high school and actually having to pay attention. The first 2 years are identical, matriculation agreements between community colleges. And I'm going to say this cautiously. Education before the university level in the U.S. can be highly varied. You can get someone who graduates from a high school that is underfunded and underprivileged, and even an all-A's student might have a very different level of average education coming from one versus the other.
Yeah.
And you've experienced this. We've both taught in the U.S. You can have a huge disparity in capability and prior learning in students at the high school level and then moving into university. And that is because we've had this, push and pull with public versus private in all sectors of the U.S. and a huge divide between the two political parties and across states. So I'm not going to make any judgment about that, but that is the reality. And the structure that has been necessary to ensure a certain standard of university students once they get into higher level 200, 300, 400 courses is to, give them these 2 years of general ed.
Yeah.
And it is definitely true that there are disparities and issues in education systems in Australia, New Zealand, and the UK. I'm not going to get into that, but my observation, especially with these having slightly more, or I should say less divided political systems and more well-structured public systems that are a bit more robust in education, because there's a more complete commitment to that in the whole society, is that students are generally, on average, more prepared to jump into course-specific work. So essentially, a lot of the classes are front-loaded. In addition to that, you almost cannot find a master's degree outside of the U.S. that doesn't have a thesis.
Yeah.
So the two ways that you can get into a PhD in the UK, Australia, and New Zealand typically are you do what's called an honors dissertation, where you add a fourth year on top of your third year. It's not always necessarily a year, where you do a small thesis, and this is typically reserved for high-performing bachelor students. And you can just tack that on, and it's considered a graduate or what we call a postgraduate qualification once you have your honors degree. And it's a smaller dissertation, and you don't have to go through the master's coursework. You go, you know what, you're ready just to go right to research, and that's a shortcut pathway where you save basically a year to get to the PhD. Most people, and in fact, I actually recommend they do this anyway because you want exposure to a larger research project to prepare you for what you're going to do in a PhD, even if you could fast track it. And also, young individuals often have a change of heart in what career they want to take. So fast tracking something in your 20s is not always a good idea. Right. It might just be fast tracking you into a stable career that then you have to exit from and restart over. But anyway, the typical thing that people do is they do their 3-year bachelor's and then they do about a 2-year master's. And there are variations in this, but the average is you do a year of coursework and then a year of research to get your thesis. Another funny thing is larger projects are called theses outside of the U.S. Larger projects are called dissertations in the U.S. So when you say, oh, I did a PhD dissertation, someone outside of the U.S. might be like, oh, why was it so small? Yeah. And vice versa if you say a thesis. So you do your master's thesis, and at this point, if you have a high enough grade in your master's and your undergraduate, you qualify for a PhD. So when I brag and say I have a second master's, it's not a brag. It's because my first master's, which I did in the U.S., which just had a final project but not an actual thesis, it didn't qualify me to get into AUT as PhD program. So I had to do what's called an MPhil, a Master's of Philosophy, or sometimes called an MRes, a Master's of Research, which you see in the UK, Australia, and New Zealand as well, which is just the thesis. And these are sometimes reserved for people who either have a professional coursework equivalent to a master's or did a master's in the States where they didn't do a research project. Something that they call a postgraduate diploma or a postgraduate certificate. These are essentially the coursework of a master's without a thesis, but they won't call it a master's degree without a thesis. And that's what you need to get into the PhD. So by the time someone starts their dissertation in the States or their thesis overseas, they typically have a very similar amount of niche topic specific coursework because they're getting an extra year in their bachelor's overseas, and the master's degree is always has a year of coursework, so it kind of end up being similar by the time you get there. Another thing to consider is that because PhDs are pure research degrees, some, and you talked about this when you did this on your own, the level of research emphasis in a PhD varies a lot more in the States than it does in a quantitative realm of sports science in the UK, US, and Australia. There is a robust degree of research you need to do. So while you do less coursework and there's no comprehensive exams, you do have to do a pretty substantial research component. And many places in the US require that as well, but it is much, the variability is far narrower, and it starts at a higher threshold overseas.
I think that
this is interesting is you don't get this, like you can say, like when people ask you, what's your PhD in? I just applied to the PhD at AUT because it is just a PhD, and I'm technically have a PhD in sport and exercise, but what I really have a PhD in was my topic, right, which I think is kind of cool too.
Yeah. Is it more common to do the like graduation by publication route in outside of the US where it's like basically they'll say like you need to publish like 3 papers that are reasonably linked into this bigger project, and once you do that, clearly you're ready to go off and do your thing?
It is more common, but it is not necessarily the norm. Okay. But it's probably it's very common in my lab. That's what we do.
Yeah.
And the reasons for that are structural. Like in many PhD programs in the U.S., your methods and research-specific classes, like you're taking a literature review class that ends up being your chapter 2, right?
Yeah.
It is your literature review. You write it in that class, and it is taught by and in partnership with one of your advisors, right, or your advisor. And then you take a methods class, and you learn how to do methods. You're in the lab, and that actually becomes your methods chapter in your dissertation. But because there aren't typically classes, sometimes they may make you have like a one methods class as a co-requisite if your CV is a little bit spotty in certain places and the graduate admissions board thinks you need to do it. But because there's no coursework in the PhD, the structural nature of a PhD, where you still have to provide a novel piece of work that answers new questions and contributes to the body of knowledge and is of a certain size and scope, what you end up doing is I'm actually going to publish a literature review, or I'll publish a study on the reliability and validity comparing, let's say, portable ultrasound to MRI as a tool for hypertrophy, and that will be kind of like my methods chapter. But in reality, what you have is a thesis that is bookended by an introduction and a conclusion, and then published work in between. And sometimes literature review is done more like a traditional 5-chapter dissertation / thesis, or it's actually published as a meta-analysis, systematic review, scoping review, etc.
Yeah.
So, like for example, I have an 8-chapter PhD, which is very, very confusing to your typical program of 5, where it goes intro, literature review, methods, results, discussion, right?
Yeah.
The other big fundamental difference, and this is interesting because it produces different relationships and different power dynamics, is that in the U.S. you have a committee, and you don't have self-funded PhDs, typically. But in the overseas programs, it's much more like a master's degree, where you pay tuition, you apply, and it's like another degree. It's much more like the process of doing a master's, right? So self-funded is kind of the norm, and then you're trying to get scholarships to pay for it, or you get a job or a graduate assistantship and you pay for it.
I didn't know
You
that.
may find a PhD that is funded externally, but it's not the default setting where an academic gets a tenure track position. They're given a certain amount of money. They start a lab, and then they apply for external grants, and they get internal funding, and they have X number of PhD spots. The constraint for how many PhDs are typically at most overseas universities is, do you have the supervision available? And then often there is some degree of subsidy from the government through the university for having a small amount of funding for you to do your PhD research. So for example, at AUT, I'll use this as an easy example. You apply centrally, and you reach out to individual academics, and you say, hey, do you have the time and the space, and when can you be my supervisory team? And there's a big distinction between supervisors and committee, which I'll get to in a moment as well. And then you get $5,000 NZD, which is about equivalent, depending upon exchange rates, around $3,000 US, to conduct your research. And of course, you can use stuff at our lab for free, and you can apply for external grants and all that fun stuff. But then you're off to the races, and you pay tuition. And the tuition for the PhD is government subsidized, so it's a lot less, and it attracts international students for that reason. But you may or may not get a stipend. You may or may not get a scholarship. That depends upon your ability to track down either an internal or an external scholarship, and that's true in multiple places. And in some places, like Spain, for example, other places where it is fully subsidized, you're paying hundreds of dollars for a PhD. It's not a big deal at all, and that's just that means that the taxes of the collective society are paying towards education more than they do in the U.S. So the economics dictate the structure and the incentives, and then the way it works. So you apply, it is self-funded, and another thing is that most universities, not all, they don't set up a tenure track professor to set up a lab, and then they have spots because of that. So for example, the last author position being the quote-unquote senior author, that's not a thing in many places around the world. The last author is just the person who contributed the least. And so it creates some strange fights over authorship and misunderstandings. And like you might say, hey, that's Zerdos's lab, or that's Ponser's lab, or that's Stu Phillips' lab. We have a Sprins lab. There's nobody whose lab it is except for Sprins. There's 80 PhD students and master students collectively who use it, and 20 academics. We schedule time, we have lab managers, but it's none of our labs. So we don't get to make those decisions. It doesn't create this kind of rubber stamp authorship of the person who runs the lab being on everything. It's not as centralized. We have a volunteer position of being a lab leader. So I'm the strength conditioning lab leader, and that's part of my role. And we have an overall lab manager, but that's more of a technician role and a health and safety role. But it's structured entirely differently, and your committee is not the same role. So in the States, your committee, it creates a dynamic where, because they are not only your mentor and your advisor, but also the person who decides whether or not you passed. Did you do the sufficient work? And then you go back and forth with them until they accept your draft and they go, all right, you're ready to do your proposal. And then, okay, you're ready to defend your thesis or your dissertation. Now you get the doctoral degree. It's a lot different because your supervisory team. So, for example, when I have students, it might be me and up to two other people, primary, secondary, and tertiary. We are only the mentor and the supervisor, but the actual thesis, the written document, is examined by two external examiners, and then they defend to those external examiners. And there are some hybrid systems where you get one or external examiner, and then also the primary advisor can chime in. But for the most part, outside of the U.S., the supervisors are basically mentoring you to become their colleague, and it's not as much of a hierarchical top-down role because they're not the ones providing funding for you to work in their lab, and it's an exchange. You do this work for me in the lab, I give you this funding, and then you get a PhD out of it. It's still kind of like an OJT mentorship, but it is much less top-down, and it creates this kind of feel of we're both in the trenches together. And when my student is ready to submit their thesis, I think it's ready for examination. I think it's worthy of a PhD. But I'm at the mercy of the two examiners. And we have a university convener who then sits down with the two examiners. They come together, they explain kind of the rules and the requirements, and I get to sit in the room or the Zoom chat room, and I'm on mute. I don't get to say a word. I'm just there for moral support unless one of the examiners directly speaks to me. So I'm nail biting. I try to prepare my students, but it's a really interesting thing, and I like it because it creates a bit of a firewall. It prevents certain conflicts of interest from arising, and it also prevents a situation where that power dynamic can become an issue. I hate to say it, but if you were to poll all the people who didn't complete a PhD, the majority of them would have some kind of life circumstance change issue that happened. Life doesn't stop for 3 to 4 years. Change of heart. They had a baby. They got divorced. They got in a car accident. They got ill. COVID happened. Whatever. But then I think the next proportion, largest of those group of people who weren't able to go over the line, was they had a really dysfunctional relationship with their advisor.
Yeah.
And their committee.
And minimal
and they
recourse.
Couldn't change it.
Yeah, minimal recourse to actually have any kind of intervention,
Yes.
It's funny because American universities will pretend that there is, but there's not. It's like you can go to the what they call an ombudsman and say like, "Hey, can you intervene in this dysfunctional relationship?" And then the ombudsman says, "Hey, you two better get along." Okay, good luck with all that. It's kind of
and especially because academics hold dual administrative roles.
Yeah.
Your advisor might also be the head of department or the dean.
Right.
They could be, or it's their lab, and they can really tie your hands.
Yeah.
And it's not that power dynamic doesn't happen or can't happen, or that you can't have an influential or bad supervisor. And there's plenty of bad supervisors outside of the U.S., but the structure, the systemic issues aren't nearly as strong. So when your primary supervisor is not the one who provides you a grade, is not the one who decides if you graduate, there are actually mechanisms in place for you just to go and be like, I need a new supervisory team. This isn't working, or they haven't, or you can go to your secondary supervisor, or actually we technically can't prevent our student from submitting, regardless of I can actively protest and say the student is not ready. They should not submit. They're going to fail. And they can go, you know what? I'm going to roll the dice. And I'm like, oh my God. But at least I've said, listen, I've washed my hands of this.
Yeah.
And then it goes to examiners.
Yeah.
So there are far clearer mechanisms in place to protect the student, and the fundamental nature of the relationship is different. I still need to be able to tell them, you're not doing well, you're not meeting the standards, you need remedial work, you need to get an extension, your work's not up to par, and you're not committed to this. But I don't then get to impose a grade on them. And pros and cons, truly.
Yeah.
I think the unstructured nature of independent, pure research study outside of the U.S., it does require truly motivated, autonomous, curious individuals. And I like that because there are less funded PhD opportunities. I remember my first conversation with John Cronin, going to be my PhD advisor. I jumped on Skype with him and I started reciting all of his research to him and how I could fit in and maybe if he had funding spots. And he was like, shut up, like, what do you want to study? And he cut me off. And I was like, oh. And he was like, yeah, if you can, get out here, you can study what you want, as long as you fit it into the time frame, logistics, and the funding budget. And if you want to apply for stipends through NSAID, whatever you want to do, like, go for it. But you can study whatever you want, so long as we have the supervisory support and the expertise to do it. So it's fundamentally different in that way. But ultimately, it provides a similar experience and qualification at the end to what you described last time, but via a very different mechanism. And there just tends to be a slightly more homogeneous pathway and outcome for it when you're looking at UK, US, New Zealand, Australia. One thing that I don't like about Australia's system, and sorry for everyone across the pond, is they don't have to do a defense at the moment. They just do a written examination. And that's a problem. That's a problem before AI, and it's a bigger problem now.
Oh, yeah, I didn't even think about that.
Yeah.
You need to jump out there and take the arrows.
I tell you this. So one of the potential conflicts of interest and problems you run into is that your supervisors on a research-based PhD, when you're doing research by publication, like an 8-chapter PhD like I was describing, they're getting pubs out of their students, right? So you can have a situation where you have a bit of a research mill, which, that happens in the U.S. as well, and students get taken advantage of, but you can have supervisors writing more than what I would describe as edits in a thesis. And if you're only reading the written work, you might be examining their supervisor, right? Yeah. But when they have to sit down and defend their work for 2 hours, that gets exposed. Yeah. And I think that's an important thing. So there are still distinctions, and absolutely, there are a wide variety of high to low quality PhDs. But it's kind of cool. You can look up, especially in universities that do a lot of thesis by publication, you can find all of their work published, and you can read their full thesis document. People have been reading my PhD. It's fully downloadable since 2017 when I finished, and my master's thesis since 2013. Most of it's published. So people, if you've read my work on protein or autoregulation, you've essentially read my thesis. Yeah. So, I look back and I go, oh man, there's definitely things I would change. There's certain things I'm not proud of the way I did it. But I do want to reiterate that the master's degree is seen as your first novice entrance into research that qualifies you for PhD, which the role of your supervisors or your committee is to take a novice researcher and mentor you on the job to the point where you, at the end of it, can call yourself like a early career researcher. So the PhD is the beginning of someone learning to do research, not nearly what it is in some other fields that's seen as kind of your magnum opus, and it should be this grand theory, and then everything else you do after that is a smaller size project, and that's true more in the humanities.
I heard
so
that.
If you're not used to that,
I heard there was like a thought that, and of course there's always exceptions, but I heard there was kind of like a cliche that as a mathematician, like, but if you're past like your mid 30s, like you missed your window to do something great. Like you were going to do a PhD, have your grand idea, publish it as this like massive breakthrough, and then like you used your one good idea. Like we all get one, and so and it's funny because in many fields that are more high volume publication, it's completely inverted. So Helms, I know you got to go. In a nutshell, PhDs from countries that aren't America, valid or invalid?
They are valid.
Okay.
And I won't even joke about it.
Okay.
Yeah. They are, you know what?
I'm kidding.
You will
Honestly,
actually be able to get a job, no problem, in the U.S. with a PhD from
yeah,
overseas.
I joke around, but in the minimal exposure I've had internationally, I mean, we went to University of Jyväskylä in Finland. I couldn't have been more impressed by their academic operations there. It was so rigorous and robust. I mean, yeah, so I joke around a lot, but yeah, what's cool about this is with PhDs, if you're interested in pursuing one, so many different ways to do it, so many different models, so you can find one that kind of fits your temperament, economic vision of how you want to do it. Yeah, a lot of different ways to make that work. Helms.
Oh, and the last thing I will say is this is a big separation between undergraduate and postgraduate or graduate studies. People I've seen been talking a lot about like the ranking of universities and things like that.
Oh yeah.
And you know, like a lot of times these are together. Like for example, I think AUT is ranked in the top 50 for sport and exercise programs consistently every year, and we have a really good publication record. So, like it's easy for me to say this, but it is 100% true that sometimes what you will have is one of the most prominent researchers in a given field at a low overall ranked university. And as a PhD student, it's not like doing an undergraduate degree where you're trying to get into an Ivy League school or the equivalent in your country because it looks good on your resume. As a graduate student, remember, you're specifically taking a qualification that's probably going to land you in academia. And in academia, the way people assess your CV is who did you get trained by? Who are your publications in Q1 journals? Are they highly cited? And are they with big, prominent, international, well-funded researchers? Who are your connections? Who did you work with? So you chase the researchers, not the university. And the universities chase the researchers. Like, it behooves a small upcoming university to snag a big researcher who is leaving another place. So when I was looking for a place to do a PhD, I was looking for advisors and the publications and the types of work that were really relevant to what I wanted to do. So that is something that at the graduate level, you're not even considering what is the university's overall rank. You're trying to consider who do I want to be my primary advisor, my committee advisor, or my primary supervisor, whatever it's called, and looking at their record and their environment and their lab specifically. And sometimes you'll get a low-ranked university with a really, really high output specific lab underneath, 3 tiers of hierarchy from university to faculty to department on down.
Quick caveat though, now that I do work at a highly ranked university, I wiped my personality clean and just uploaded that. So now that is central to my identity. And in many ways, I would suggest it's the only thing that matters. Well,
we're both working at big universities. I mean, I realize that you're rocking the Duke thing and I got the AUT
we're shilling hard.
On, so that's absolutely right.
All right, Helms, you claimed that you had a tight window here, so we got to get you going, right?
Yeah, I need to get.
You kept going. I kept trying to give you ways out, and you kept going.
I can't help it. I'm rushing you, and then I take up more airspace. I'm just a narcissist.
All right, folks. No comment. Folks, appreciate you so much for joining us. We like to have fun around here. Thanks so much for joining the live chat. Please be sure to like, rate, subscribe, review. Check out massresearchreview.com. Check out our friends at Elite FTS. And as always, thanks so much for joining us. We will be back with another episode in 7 days. So everybody have an absolutely fantastic week.